Hello, my name is Gustavo San Roman and I would like to thank you for taking the time to view this presentation. I have combined my years of experience as an obstetrician with my background in computer programming and birth statistics in order to create software tools that can be used to measure, compare, and improve the care that is provided to women who will give birth. This drawing represents a cesarean birth performed in 1884 that was reported in the Edinburgh Medical Journal. This is shown to remind us that prior to modern obstetrics, every woman had a risk that her labor may not result in a vaginal birth. This risk was based on the physical characteristics of the woman and that of her baby. I call this risk inherent risk. A cesarean birth measure is a measure of the effect that the obstetrical care provider's interventions have on their patient's inherent risk. For example, obstetrical care providers that are skilled with forceps can decrease a woman's inherent risk, and impatient obstetrical care providers can increase a woman's inherent risk. Does each woman have the same inherent risk? No, they don't. Each woman's unique combination of physical characteristics determines her inherent risk that labor will result in a cesarean birth. In an attempt to create a cesarean birth measure, the American College of OB/GYN stated in their evaluation of cesarean delivery that differences in patient characteristics probably account for some of the variations in cesarean delivery rates and explain some of the differences between practitioners and hospitals. This means that you cannot measure the effect of the obstetrical care provider's interventions without taking into account the physical characteristics of the women who are giving birth. They also stated that the highest variation in cesarean birth rates occurs among nulliparous patients with term singleton fetuses with vertex presentations without other complications. High-risk patients have much lower variations in cesarean delivery rates between practitioners and hospitals. Note the underlined part of the second statement. This part of the statement is why the NTSV case mix is mistakenly called low risk. The NTSV case mix is referred to as the cesarean birth measure for low-risk patients. But low risk for what? The NTSV case mix includes patients with placenta previa, fetal distress prior to labor, medical contraindication for labor, patients with an uninducible cervix, and women who request a cesarean birth. There is nothing low risk about patients with these diagnoses. More importantly is that despite ACOG's statement that patient characteristics probably account for some of the variation in cesarean birth rates, the NTSV rate ignores the physical characteristics of the women that are giving birth. So just how much do physical characteristics contribute to a woman's inherent risk? Dr. Chen and his group in Florida studied the outcome of 3,355 nulliparous women who were managed by the same obstetrical group. This is important because if patients are managed by the same obstetrical group, then the results are due to the inherent risk of the women giving birth and not to the effect of the obstetrical care provider. Dr. Chen found that their teenagers had a 13% cesarean birth rate, whereas their patients over 35 had 3 times that rate. They saw a similar pattern with maternal BMI, maternal height, and gestational age. Maternal weight gain and newborn birth weight also affected the cesarean birth rate, but note that the association was not linear. They came to the conclusion that maternal age, maternal BMI, maternal height, maternal weight gain, gestational age, and newborn birth weight all significantly affected a woman's inherent risk for cesarean birth. In 2006, Dr. Elliot Main and his group in California published a cesarean birth measure based on the NTSV case mix and proved that adjusting for age was mandatory due to the significant difference between the cesarean birth rates of younger and older NTSV patients. The inherent risk due to increasing age was similar in California as it was in Dr. Chen's study from Florida. However, if Hospital A only had younger patients, then their unadjusted NTSV rate would be less than 14%. And if Hospital A only had older patients, then their unadjusted NTSV rate would be over 25%, even though the same obstetrical care providers were taking care of these patients. The effect of age on the cesarean birth rate is not limited to Florida and California. This is the breakdown of cesarean birth rates according to the National Vital Statistics Report over the past 20 years. This illustrates the significant impact of age on the rate of cesarean birth across the nation. This report also illustrates how the rates have gone up in every age group over these years. It is this increasing rate over the past 20 years that raises much concern regarding appropriate cesarean birth utilization. As a result, Healthy People 2020 has set a national goal of 23.9% for cesarean births to NTSV patients. The Healthy People 2020 national target represents an average for the entire nation. Unfortunately, some organizations like the Leapfrog Group have misinterpreted this national target as a target rate to be achieved by each and every hospital. It is mathematically incorrect to compare a hospital's unadjusted NTSV cesarean birth rate to the national target of 23.9%. For example, if your hospital has NTSV patients with an average age of 35 to 39, you haven't hit that target in the past 20 years, and you will never be able to achieve an unadjusted NTSV rate of 23.9%. The significant difference in the unadjusted NTSV rate due to the age of the women giving birth illustrates why it is impossible to measure the effect of the obstetrical care provider's interventions without adjusting for the age of the women who are giving birth. Unless, of course, if all hospitals have women of the same age giving birth. Dr. Main's group reported a mean maternal age from a high of 32.3 to a low of 21.9 in their 20 hospitals. This made it obvious that hospitals do not have women of the same age giving birth. His work confirmed the significant effect of maternal age on the NTSV cesarean birth rate. And since many hospitals have different age distributions, he proposed using a technique called direct standardization in order to level the playing field. Lastly, he noted that the age adjustment can make major differences. Dr. Main's work became the Cesarean Birth Measure that was endorsed by the National Quality Forum, the Joint Commission, and the Leapfrog Group. Unfortunately, there is a fatal mathematical flaw in Dr. Main's work that was not recognized by Dr. Main, the editors of the Gray Journal, the National Quality Forum, the Joint Commission, or the Leapfrog Group. This fatal flaw is in the direct standardization and is called the leveraging error. It affects every hospital that does not have the same NTSV patient age distribution as the national average. For example, this is the table from Dr. Main's study, and if your hospital has the same age distribution as Dr. Main's hospital, you will find that there is only 68 patients in the 15 to 19-year-old age group. These 68 patients make up only 1% of the 7,068 births. However, this age group makes up 21% of the adjusted NTSV rate. When you do the math, you will find that one additional cesarean birth this month compared to last month in the 15 to 19-year-old age group would increase this hospital's cesarean birth measure by 10 percentage points, even though this hospital has about 500 total births each month. A detailed analysis of this error can be found on my website. It is this fatal flaw that renders the results of Dr. Main's original cesarean birth measure useless. I discovered this fatal flaw in 2010 and did my best to inform Dr. Main, the Joint Commission, and the American College of OBGYN that this flaw would render the measure useless. However, it appears that instead of going back to the drawing board and creating a better risk adjustment for age, Dr. Main began a campaign to convince everyone that the NTSV rate doesn't have to be adjusted for age. This is slide number 44 of his 2014 presentation titled Making Sense of Cesarean Birth Rates. How should we invest our QI efforts? In this presentation, he claimed that hospitals with high rates of advancing maternal age also have high rates of low BMIs, and when analyzed, they balance each other out. The first two bullet points contradict 20 years of prior research, including his own work from 2006. So Dr. Main has either made an incredible new discovery or he has made another fatal error. The third bullet point refers to a fully loaded risk adjustment and leads you to believe that his incredible discovery is confirmed coast to coast. However, if you notice the studies supporting this incredible discovery, you will find that Dr. Main's manuscript and preparation has never been published and that the second reference is even more troublesome. What is troubling about Eckert J. is that Eckert J. is not the lead author on the study for Mass General Hospital. He is the seventh author listed in the study whose lead author is Cesarean. Why would anyone list a study by its seventh author? Dr. Main is making the incredible claim that the effect of maternal BMI cancels out the effect of maternal age. However, since he is yet to publish his manuscript, perhaps it is the study from Cesarean that contains the indisputable evidence that will prove that BMI cancels out age. Keep in mind that this is the only published study submitted by Dr. Main, the Leapfrog Group, the Joint Commission, and the National Quality Forum in support of Dr. Main's incredible discovery. If we look at the covariates listed in the methods section of this study, does anyone see maternal BMI? I see mother's age, race, ethnicity, education, infant birth weight, gestational age, labor induction, hospital shift at time of birth, and pre-existing health conditions, but I don't see maternal BMI. Perhaps maternal BMI can be found inside the study in the table of covariates. Does anyone see maternal BMI there? What I do see in Table 1 is the significant effect that maternal age had on the rate of cesarean birth. The NTSV patients over the age of 35 in this study had a 41% cesarean birth rate as compared to 21.7% for the NTSV patients under 30. I also see in Table 1 some peculiar findings. The authors included maternal education and shift at birth as risk factors, but omitted the much more significant maternal BMI. It is also very peculiar as to how the cesarean birth rate for patients with placenta previa was only 71.9%. One has to question the quality of data collection in this study if somehow 28.1% of patients who have a placenta previa were delivered vaginally. Again, keep in mind that this study is the only published study referenced by the Leapfrog Group, the Joint Commission, and the National Quality Forum in order to justify removing all risk adjustments from the NTSV cesarean birth rate. A critical analysis of this study can be found at my website. In 2015, Dr. Main was the head of the Maternity Care Expert Panel at the Leapfrog Group, and the age adjustment is removed from the cesarean birth rates that they are publishing nationwide. Why did the Leapfrog Group remove the age adjustment, you might ask? They claim that research has shown that the age effect disappears when you include BMI in the model. When I contacted the Leapfrog Group and requested a list of the studies that made up the research, I was sent one study, and that was the study by Cesarean. That would be the same study that doesn't even have BMI as a risk factor. In 2016, Dr. Main was on the Joint Commission's Perinatal Care Technical Advisory Panel, and as the developer of their Cesarean Birth Measure provided this response to the National Quality Forum when I questioned the removal of the risk adjustment from Cesarean Birth Measure PCO2. Once again, we see that Dr. Main makes the incredible claim that maternal BMI cancels out the effect of maternal age based on the findings of only 2 studies. Since the study by Cesarean didn't have maternal BMI as a risk factor, this means that every hospital and obstetrical care provider in the United States is going to be measured using a cesarean birth measure that is supported only by an oral presentation given by the person whose last cesarean birth measure had an unrecognized fatal flaw. I did my best in 2016 to alert the National Quality Forum of the disaster that will result from using an unadjusted NTSV rate as a cesarean birth measure. This is the final submission from the Joint Commission to the National Quality Forum, explaining the decision to remove the direct standardization risk adjustment from Cesarean Birth Measure PCO2. The first highlighted sentence indicates that the Joint Commission has finally come to admit the fatal flaw that I discovered back in 2010. Unfortunately, in the second highlighted sentence, they make their next fatal flaw. They claim that they did an analysis of 2014 discharge data with logistic regression that indicated that age strata had marginal impact on the outcome. This analysis contradicts 20 years of research, yet they didn't keep the results. How convenient. Once again, the only published study in support of their incredible findings is the study by Caceres. One would think that this incredible new discovery would be proudly displayed on the Joint Commission's website. This is the 2017 reference list for the Joint Commission Cesarean Birth Measure PCO2. And it is notable that even though this list was updated after the removal of the age risk adjustment, that neither the study by Caceres nor the oral presentation by Dr. Main made the list. However, the three highlighted studies that did remain on the list all came to the conclusion that maternal age had a significant impact on outcome. I have shown you the fatal flaw in the direct standardization age risk adjustment that was missed by Dr. Main, the editors of the Gray Journal, the National Quality Forum, the Joint Commission, and the Leapfrog Group. I will now show you the fatal flaw in Dr. Main's new incredible discovery. Dr. Chen, Dr. Main, and many others have proven that the cesarean rate for nulliparous women within a hospital increases with increasing age. And I have shown you 20 years of results from the National Vital Statistics reports that confirm that the effect of age is also present nationwide. In order for Dr. Main to make the claim that an analysis using logistic regression indicates that age strata had marginal impact on the outcome, there has to be a risk factor for cesarean birth that decreases the risk of cesarean birth for older women. Dr. Main provided that risk factor several times with his observation that hospitals with a high maternal age population also have a low body mass index, and conversely, those with low maternal age have a high BMI. Consider the logic behind Dr. Main's incredible discovery. Dr. Main can't possibly be claiming that women get thinner as they get older, because if that claim were true, then no one would have ever noticed the significant effect of age on outcome, because if older women were thinner and younger women were heavier, then these two factors would have canceled each other out, and the NTSV cesarean birth rate would be the same for all age groups. No, what Dr. Main is actually claiming is that hospitals with older NTSV patients attract women that are thinner across all age groups, and hospitals with younger NTSV patients attract women that are heavier across all age groups. For his claim to be correct, every hospital across the country would have to attract the exact combination of NTSV patients where the risk due to age and the risk due to BMI completely cancel each other out, while still maintaining an NTSV cesarean birth rate within the hospital and across the country that increases with age. This incredible discovery is based on an analysis that was thrown away, an oral presentation given by the person who gave us the previous flawed cesarean birth measure, and is supported by only one published study that doesn't even have BMI as a risk factor. Just like in the Emperor's New Clothes, it is only a matter of time before he is exposed. The last time that I exposed a fatal flaw in Dr. Main's work, it took 6 years for the Joint Commission to acknowledge the error. Hopefully, the Joint Commission will acknowledge their new fatal flaw before it does a serious disservice to both the women who are giving birth and the healthcare professionals that are assisting them. I have shown you that maternal age has a significant effect on outcome. But what about the other 5 physical characteristics identified by Dr. Chen's group? This is a bar graph of the percentage of pregnant patients that were obese by state in 2011, and note that not every state is represented. The low is 18% in Utah, and the high is 28.6% in South Carolina. This graph illustrates that maternal body mass index, just like maternal age, does not appear to be distributed equally. It follows that if BMI is not distributed equally, then just like for maternal age, a cesarean birth measure must account for the inherent risk due to maternal body mass index. What about the other 4 physical characteristics that have been previously proven to contribute to inherent risk? My analysis of 109 hospitals in New York State confirmed that these hospitals not only had important differences in maternal age and BMI, but that they also had different average values for maternal height, newborn weight, maternal weight gain, and gestational age. So it follows that unless hospitals have patients that are the same height, with the same size babies, gaining the same amount of weight, and giving birth at the same gestational age, then a cesarean birth measure must account for the inherent risk due to these other 4 physical characteristics as well. In fact, I am going to add a 7th characteristic that must be accounted for, and that is whether the onset of labor was spontaneous or induced. These are the 7 most important characteristics that affect the risk of cesarean birth for the NTSV patient who will attempt labor. Before we can measure the effect of the obstetrical care provider's interventions, we have to first measure the effect of the physical characteristics of the women who are giving birth. Looking at these 7 patient characteristics reveals that the cesarean birth rate for a typical 36-year-old that is being induced is more than 10 times higher than that of a typical 18-year-old who arrives to the hospital in spontaneous labor. More than 10 times higher. There is nothing low risk about our 36-year-old patients who are included in the NTSV cesarean birth rate. If a hospital's average patient is similar to this 36-year-old, then it really doesn't matter how good the obstetrical care provider's interventions are. They will never, I repeat, never, be able to achieve the target NTSV cesarean birth rate being set by the World Health Organization, Healthy People 2020, the Joint Commission, the Leapfrog Group, or any other organization that is using a cesarean birth measure that does not account for the inherent risk of the women who are giving birth. Conversely, a hospital with mostly 18-year-old patients can have interventions that result in many unnecessary cesarean births, yet they will consistently achieve the target cesarean birth rate. What is most frightening about this is that the interventions being used at hospitals with mostly 18-year-olds could be propagated to other hospitals as being the best interventions, simply because they come from hospitals that have mostly 18-year-old patients, and not because they are the best at decreasing the inherent risk of the women that are giving birth. This frightening thought is why using an unadjusted NTSV rate as a cesarean birth measure creates a tremendous disservice to the women that will give birth. The case mix flaws in the NTSV rate and the fact that it does not account for the inherent risk of the women that are giving birth renders it useless as a cesarean birth measure. In 2011, the World Health Organization recommended using the Robson classification system as a cesarean birth measure. The Robson system classifies all women into one of 10 categories, including an unadjusted NTSV category. With all due respect to the World Health Organization, it is irresponsible to recommend a cesarean birth measure that does not take into account the inherent risk of the women that are giving birth. Women deserve a cesarean birth measure that doesn't ignore the inherent risk of the women who are giving birth. In order to create a cesarean birth measure that doesn't have case mix flaws like the NTSV case mix, and more importantly accounts for the inherent risk of the women who are giving birth, I started with 3 simple suppositions. First is that the majority of pregnant women will attempt labor with the goal of achieving a vaginal birth. Second is that the pregnant women who do not attempt labor presumably schedule a cesarean birth as the result of a well-informed discussion with their obstetrical care provider. And third, if one assumes that all of the scheduled cesarean births are appropriate, then the only way to decrease the cesarean birth rate is to study the women who labor. Therefore, My case mix includes only women who attempt labor with a singleton baby in vertex presentation between 37 and 42 weeks without a history of a prior cesarean birth. Comparing this case mix to the NTSV case mix reveals that this case mix will not include patients with conditions like placenta previa or any other condition that results in a scheduled cesarean birth. Unlike the NTSV case mix, my case mix is not limited to nulliparous women. This case mix will include approximately 2/3 of all women who give birth. Keep in mind that from this point forward, that all data and results in this presentation will refer to only women who meet the criteria for this case mix. The most important rule when creating a cesarean birth measure is that labor is a physical process, and the risk that this physical process will end in a cesarean birth is determined by both inherent risk and applied risk. Since this is the most important rule, I am going to say it again. Labor is a physical process, and the risk that this physical process will end in a cesarean birth is determined by both inherent risk and applied risk. So if we look at this rule as a math equation, we see that a woman's risk for cesarean birth during labor is equal to her inherent risk times the applied risk, and keep in mind that the applied risk can either increase or decrease the inherent risk. These are the 7 most important physical characteristics for determining inherent risk for women who will labor. In order to prove this, I analyzed the outcomes of 284,156 women who labored in New York State with a term singleton vertex pregnancy without a history of a prior cesarean birth. The data represent the outcomes achieved by 2,915 obstetrical care providers working out of 109 hospitals. The first physical characteristic is parity. Women with at least one prior vaginal birth decreased their rate of cesarean birth from 25% to 5%. Since parity is such an important factor, analysis of the physical characteristics will be divided by parity into either nulliparous or multiparous. The next physical characteristic, fetal weight, is interesting in that, as expected, increasing fetal weight increased the rate of cesarean birth, but only when the fetal weight was above 2,900 grams or 6 pounds 6 ounces. When the fetal weight is less than 2,900 grams, it is decreasing fetal weight that increased the rate of cesarean birth. This nonlinear association was similar to that found by Dr. Chen's group in Florida. With initial body mass index, you can see that the rate of cesarean birth for first-time mothers was about the same as their initial body mass index. Maternal age is next. Note that only 16% of the 18-year-old first-time mothers had a cesarean birth, whereas that number increased to 30% for our 32-year-olds and becomes 40% by age 40. Next, we have maternal height. 24% of first-time mothers who were 5 foot 4 inches tall had a cesarean birth, whereas being 4 inches shorter increased that percentage to 32%. The next physical characteristic is gestational age, and note that increasing gestational age increased the rate of cesarean birth. The last physical characteristic is maternal weight gain. Note that women who put on more or less weight than recommended had a greater rate of cesarean birth. This is also similar to the findings from Dr. Chen's group. I hope that by this point I have proven to you that a woman's physical characteristics will determine their inherent risk. However, remember that the risk of cesarean birth is not only determined by a woman's inherent risk, but will also be affected by the labor management strategies used by the obstetrical care provider. So let's look at some labor management strategies. Some obstetrical care providers induce most of their patients. Some will use fundal pressure, a vacuum, or forceps. Some jump to cesarean birth at the first sign of a problem, and some are more patient than others in allowing labor to progress. Some obstetrical care providers strongly believe that labor is less likely to end in a cesarean birth by using care that supports the normal physiology of labor. Other labor management strategies include augmentation, early admission, continuous fetal monitoring, the use of epidural anesthesia, and adherence to the Friedman curve. This brings us to other risk factors for cesarean birth. I believe that these factors don't actually affect the ability of the baby to pass through the birth canal, but rather patients with these factors have increased inherent risk or applied risk as follows. Hypertension comes with an increase in inherent risk through induction of labor, fetal size smaller than 2,900 grams, and pre-labor cesarean birth. Gestational diabetes comes with an increase in inherent risk due to both maternal and fetal factors, as well as the risk of induction. Maternal education remains a mystery to me. How does the uterus of the baby know how smart the mother is? Does drinking too much beer in college cause the uterine muscle to become flabby? I think that once there is an accounting of inherent risk, we will find that education is no longer a risk factor. Lastly, maternal insurance. Really? Does the uterus of the baby care how much the obstetrical care provider is getting paid? Payment only matters to the obstetrical care provider, so it may not come as a shock that once there is an accounting of inherent risk, this risk factor is actually applied risk. Now that we have a better understanding of inherent risk and applied risk, we can go back to our most important rule. This equation shows us that in order to determine the applied risk, we need to know the cesarean birth rate and the inherent risk for the group of women that are giving birth. The cesarean birth rate is easy because it is a known number. The inherent risk of a group of women is equal to the average of the inherent risk of each woman in the group. Therefore, all we have to do to create an accurate cesarean birth measure is figure out how to accurately assign an inherent risk for each woman in the group. Once we know the inherent risk, it is simple math to calculate the applied risk. Inherent risk is calculated for each woman by finding a cohort of 100 similar women in our database who have given birth in the same state. Or in other words, the inherent risk for a woman giving birth is assigned based on what has already happened to 100 women just like her. Similar means that the cohort of women will be similar in these 8 characteristics. This is how the Birthrisk Cesarean Birth Measure accounts for all 8 of these risk factors. Contrast this to other cesarean birth measures that only account for age, parity, or perhaps nothing at all. If in the cohort of 100 similar women there were 20 cesarean births, then the inherent risk for that woman is 20%. We then assign an inherent risk to each woman in the group. We can use the average of these inherent risks to create the inherent risk for the group. Now that we know both the cesarean birth rate and the inherent risk for any given group of women, we can solve the equation for the applied risk, and this creates the Birthrisk Cesarean Birth Measure. For example, if obstetrical care provider number 1 has patients with an average inherent risk of 20%, and that provider has a 40% cesarean birth rate for these women, then the Birthrisk Cesarean Birth Measure is equal to 40% divided by 20%, which gives this obstetrical care provider an initial Birthrisk Cesarean Birth Measure of 2. In order to account for changing practice patterns and to create a more meaningful number, the initial Birthrisk Cesarean Birth Measure is then multiplied by the background cesarean birth rate for the time period in which the births occurred. If the background cesarean birth rate was 15%, then the final Birthrisk Cesarean Birth Measure for this provider is 30%. If we compare obstetrical care provider number 1 to the average provider, we find that they are twice as likely to perform a cesarean birth. The unique method used to assign inherent risk gives the Birthrisk Cesarean Birth Measure the ability to provide results by hospital, obstetrical group, or solo practice, and includes all obstetricians, family practitioners, and midwives. I have shown you how I created the Birthrisk Cesarean Birth Measure, but how do we know it accurately measures the risk applied by the obstetrical care provider to their population of patients? The answer is that we must validate that the inherent risk assigned is accurate. To do this, we must go back to our original equation. If the inherent risk and the Birthrisk Cesarean Birth Measure are accurate, then they can be used to accurately predict the actual cesarean birth rate for any given group of women. Validation can only be obtained by comparing the actual cesarean birth rate to the predicted cesarean birth rate. Validation was obtained by taking 182,722 birth records and using the inherent risk for each record and the Birthrisk Cesarean Birth Measure for that provider and predicting the percent risk of cesarean birth for that record using a computer algorithm that does not know the actual outcome for that record. For example, if the birth record had an inherent risk of 20% and the obstetrical care provider had a Birthrisk Cesarean Birth Measure of 2, then that record would be assigned a predicted risk of 40%. But if that very same record had an obstetrical care provider whose Birthrisk Cesarean Birth Measure was 1, then that record would have been assigned a predicted risk of only 20%. Each of the 182,722 birth records was given a predicted risk, and then these records were sorted into 99 groups based on predicted risk from 1% to 99%. The actual cesarean birth rate of each group was then compared to the predicted cesarean birth rate for that group. This is the only accurate method that exists to validate a cesarean birth measure. This graph illustrates how accurately the Birthrisk Cesarean Birth Measure was able to predict actual outcome. The accuracy of the predictions confirms the accuracy of the method used to assign inherent risk, as well as the method used to create the cesarean birth measure for each obstetrical care provider. The Birthrisk Cesarean Birth Measure is the only cesarean birth measure available that provides validation of its accuracy. Validation proves that the Birthrisk Cesarean Birth Measure is accurate and can therefore be used to evaluate the labor management strategies being used by obstetrical care providers at different hospitals. I started by looking at only nulliparous women in labor in New York State. I found that the hospital whose patients had the highest inherent risk had a cesarean birth rate of 22.29%, and the hospital whose patients had the lowest inherent risk had a cesarean birth rate of 13.99%. With our current standards, it appears that the hospital with the 13.99% cesarean birth rate has labor management strategies that result in fewer cesarean births than the hospital with the 22.29% cesarean birth rate. This will lead women to believe that their risk for a cesarean birth will be much less if they go to the hospital with the 13.99% cesarean birth rate. However, the Birthrisk Cesarean Birth Measure reveals a very different picture. The Birthrisk Cesarean Birth Measure reveals that of these two hospitals, it is the one with the higher cesarean birth rate that is using labor management strategies that were better at decreasing the inherent risk of their patients. Therefore, if a woman wants to go to the hospital that is best at decreasing her risk of a cesarean birth, then she should go to the hospital with the 22.29% cesarean birth rate. The Birthrisk Cesarean Birth Measure is currently the only measure available that can adjust a cesarean birth rate to reflect the inherent risk of the women who are giving birth. Unfortunately, now that you are aware of how important the concept of inherent risk can be and how it is used to create the Birthrisk Cesarean Birth Measure, it is time to turn some of your current thinking upside down. Prior to the Birthrisk Cesarean Birth Measure, obstetrical care providers determined the effect of a labor management strategy by conducting a scientific study where similar groups of women were used and where only one group was exposed to the labor management strategy that you wanted to study. If the cesarean birth rate was different between the two groups, then the labor management strategy was believed to affect the risk of cesarean birth. So I decided to do a study, and I started with two groups of women that contained 2,000 births in each group, and each group was represented by approximately 1,000 different obstetrical care providers working out of 100 hospitals. Note that all births were to nulliparous women in spontaneous labor. For this type of study to be effective, you need to confirm that the two groups being studied were similar, and this is done by looking at the average values for the risk factors in each group. As you can see here, my two groups have similar fetal weight and initial body mass index. My two groups also have similar maternal age, but the study group has a slightly greater average maternal weight gain, which may lead this group to have a higher risk for cesarean birth. The two groups have similar average maternal height and average gestational age. It would appear that I have two similar groups of women and that any difference in the cesarean birth rate would come from the labor management strategy that is being studied. And as expected, the study group has a significantly different cesarean birth rate, So therefore, we come to the conclusion that the labor management strategy being studied decreased the rate of cesarean birth. But wait a second. What was the labor management strategy being studied? The problem with this study is that there is no difference in the labor management strategies applied to the two groups. So why is there a statistically significantly different cesarean birth rate in the study group, you might ask? Well, that has to do with how I created the two groups. The control group was created by combining younger women having smaller babies with older women having larger babies, and the study group was created by combining younger women having the larger babies with older women having the smaller babies. I created these two groups in this fashion to illustrate that having two groups of women with similar average risk factors does not necessarily confirm that the two groups had the same inherent risk for cesarean birth. This is because inherent risk is dependent on each woman's unique combination of physical characteristics and not the average of the group. As you can see here, my software was able to determine that these two groups had different inherent risk. So when you read a study about whether or not a labor management strategy increases or decreases the risk of cesarean birth, ask yourself if the two groups being studied had the same inherent risk for cesarean birth. And remember that having similar average values does not necessarily mean that the two groups had the same inherent risk. If the inherent risk of two groups being compared is different, as we have here, then only the Birthrisk Cesarean Birth Measure has the ability to determine if the labor management strategy applied to the study group significantly affects the risk of cesarean birth. As you can see here, the Birthrisk Cesarean Birth Measure for each group was the same, which is what you would have expected since the two groups did not have different labor management strategies. This study illustrates how the Birthrisk Cesarean Birth Measure is able to measure applied risk regardless of the cesarean birth rate or inherent risk of the patients being studied. This is really important, so I'm going to say it again. This study illustrates how the Birthrisk Cesarean Birth Measure is able to measure applied risk regardless of the cesarean birth rate or inherent risk of the patients being studied. This can be further illustrated by looking at the four groups which were combined into a control group and a study group. This table represents the four initial groups used to create the study. Note the very different cesarean birth rates and very different inherent risk for each of our four groups. Also note the very similar Birthrisk Cesarean Birth Measure for each group. Once again, this illustrates the ability of the Birthrisk Cesarean Birth Measure to be used in any population of patients, and it is this ability that can empower every obstetrical care provider with the ability to find the labor management strategies that can safely decrease the cesarean birth rate. So now you know that it will take the concept of inherent risk and the Birthrisk Cesarean Birth Measure to get the world of obstetrics right side up. The Birthrisk Cesarean Birth Measure provides a robust suite of reporting features. This is a report using actual data for hospitals in New York State. There were over 70,000 births with a 14.89% cesarean birth rate. The subentity for this report is hospital, and 101 hospitals are represented. There are 20 hospitals that had Birthrisk Cesarean Birth Measures that were statistically significantly higher than the average for the state. There were 58 hospitals whose measures were not statistically significantly different from the average, and there were 23 hospitals that had measures that were statistically significantly better than the average for the state. In red are the worst 5 hospitals, and in green are the best 5 hospitals. This type of report could be used by healthcare administrators to create value-based reimbursement or by accreditation agencies to determine centers of excellence and centers that need improvement. The worst hospital on the list is number 5760. This report is a breakdown of the births at that hospital. This report sorts the results first by parity into nulliparous and multiparous, and then by onset of labor into spontaneous or induced. This hospital's cesarean birth rate for induced nulliparous women was 52.50% for women who only had an inherent risk of 30.48%. Or in other words, when compared to the average hospital, this hospital performed an additional 22 cesarean births per 100 nulliparous women who were induced. If we look at their numbers for induced multiparous women, please note that they also performed an additional 20 cesarean births per 100 multiparous women who were induced. Hospitals are made up of obstetrical care providers, and this report shows the obstetrical providers from Hospital 5760 as the subentity. Here you can see that 6 providers had a Birthrisk Cesarean Birth Measure that were statistically significantly worse than the average for New York State, and the rest were average. This report, along with the previous report, can be used by hospital administrators to monitor cesarean birth utilization at their institution. This report is the breakdown for the provider with the most births at Hospital 5760. When we look at this provider's multiparous patients who were induced, we see an incomprehensible 36% cesarean birth rate for women who only had an inherent risk of 6.77%. Or in other words, when compared to the average provider, this provider performed an additional 30 cesarean births per 100 multiparous women who were induced. These reports illustrate the importance of using a cesarean birth measure that not only includes inherent risk, but also provides results for both nulliparous and multiparous women. So how do we get started on what seems to be an overwhelming data collection task? As Rocky Balboa showed us, you take one step at a time. Every hospital currently collects data for every birth. This data may be on paper, in a spreadsheet, or in an electronic medical record. Every birth is reported even if it is not included in the case mix. There are 6 simple questions that determine if the birth fits the case mix, and you can stop the data collection as soon as you have one yes. Once it has been determined that the birth is to be included in the case mix, then only 10 additional pieces of data are needed to complete the data collection. The data collection can be accomplished by a direct data bridge if the entity has an electronic medical record, by structured format if the information is in a spreadsheet format, and the information can even be submitted via scan, fax, or by mail. Detailed reports are provided accounting for all birth records. This will also include an accounting of missing or incomplete data. Entities can conduct process improvement using the detailed reports that are available to them. In closing, the Birthrisk Cesarean Birth Measure is a software tool that can empower each and every obstetrical care provider with the ability to find the labor management strategies that can safely decrease the cesarean birth rate in an effort to improve the care that is provided to the women who will give birth. I would like to thank you for taking the time to view this presentation.